Welcome back. We're so glad that you've tuned in again. We're jumping right back into our weekly Bible reading here on You Are From God. Scott, we're here in Proverbs 17. We're going to anchor ourselves in some wisdom that God has given us to walk according to his will, and then we're going to see how that works as we're talking about Jesus in the book of Hebrews.
Yeah, Proverbs 17 is where we are. He just continues the conversation, the contrast between those that are upright, those that are following God, compared to the wicked or the foolish, as we've talked about. And these, again, are just some verses that really just kind of stick out. I encourage you to read the whole chapter if you haven't, but just was point out a couple that really stick out, at least to me. Verse 1, he says, "Better is a dry morsel and quietness with it than a house full of feasting with strife." And obviously, as we go through these, you just notice that there's a lot of similar topics that are being talked about, and you certainly see that here. Strife is an issue for a lot of people, and quite frankly, just having that peace is so important. And that's what he's talking about here, striving for that peace. Certainly as a child of God, we're striving for true peace that's found in God only. And you certainly see that as we'll go forward here. Verse 3 says, "The refining pot is for silver and for the furnace of gold, but the Lord tests hearts." And we've discussed this before. He'll talk about the Lord knows the motives. God knows our hearts. And it doesn't matter what the outside's going to look like. It doesn't matter the other things that we think we're doing for show. It's about God knowing our heart. Verse 5, "He who mocks the poor taunts his maker, and he who rejoices at calamity will not go unpunished." This is an issue you see throughout the scriptures, and you certainly can have it today. When we are mocking those that are less fortunate than us, or making fun of those types of things, God knows. God is the maker of those people that we may be looking down on. He is and desires to be their father. That's unbelievably important for us to always remember. And then verse 6, "Grandchildren are the crown of old men, and the glory of sons is their fathers." And so one of the things, again, we see throughout the Proverbs is the importance of family and understanding those relationships that we can have with one another. This is the chapter in verse 17 that'll say, "A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity." Again, the relationships that we have. Verse 22, "A joyful heart is good medicine, but a broken spirit dries up the bones." And then finally in verse 27 and 28, "He who restrains his words has knowledge, and he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding. Even a fool, when he keeps silent, is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is considered prudent." Verse 28 runs through my mind a lot. Just keep your mouth shut, as James will talk about as well. But this will take us, to Hebrews, where you're dealing again with God and the better coming. And sometimes we try to make connections that aren't there. We try to say, okay, let's just bring in the Old Testament back into the New, as is what's going on here. And the author of Hebrews is making it very clear that this is the better covenant, and this is really where we're picking up in chapter 7.
Yeah, so he's kind of teased Melchizedek a few times now, after taking a little sidebar conversation to tell them, you need to keep growing and maturing. We're confident in this. This is why you can have confidence and mature, because God's given you his promises. You have this great and sure hope. Now he gets back to the topic at hand as he's making these comparisons that Jesus is superior in every way to everything under that old covenant. And so now we're talking about the priesthood. And he doesn't go back and start comparing to the Old Covenant Mosaic law priesthood right away. He goes back even further than that to Genesis 14, where Abraham encounters this character that we only read about in the Old Testament in that chapter. It is only when Abraham's coming back from rescuing Lot and defeating other kings that he encounters the king of Salem, which will later be called Jerusalem. And this is the king, King Melchizedek. And he's also not just a king, but a priest of the Most High God, or God Most High, as you see in verse 1 there. And so there's a lot of unique things that title is used in the Genesis account of God Most High, or the Most High God, saying that regardless of what other idols or gods people were worshiping at the time, this is the God. This is the one true God. And so he goes into some descriptions here about why he's such a big deal, even though there's so little mentioned about him. He's the king of righteousness according to his name. That's what his name means. And he's also the king of Salem. So that's the name of the city, but Salem means peace. So obviously you start seeing the connections. Jesus is the king of righteousness. Jesus is the king of peace. It talks about, there's no father or mother genealogy no beginning of days or end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues as a priest forever. Basically saying there's no systematic structure that Melchizedek was operating under, aside from God appointed him. This was a priest serving God. And then you talk about, look, he was a great high priest. Abraham gave him tithes. And it's later on that the people will give Abraham's descendant Levi the tithes. So he's making all these comparisons simply to point out if Jesus is like Melchizedek, he is better than any other high priest you could think of under the Mosaical law. And verses 11 through 14 touch on this. He says, by the fact that Jesus is a high priest, not from the tribe of Levi, because he spells that out in verse 14, it's evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests. Side note, this is a verse that really causes us to pay attention to the importance where the Bible doesn't specify things. People will say that silence is permissive, like, well, the Bible didn't tell me not to do this, God didn't say not to do this thing. We got to take God at his word and not presume upon it. Here, it's being pretty clear as how the scripture is referring to itself, that if God didn't say anything about it, you can't just appoint a high priest. Because Jesus is a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, it necessarily means, it's a forced conclusion, that the priesthood has changed. We're not under that old covenant priesthood under the Levites anymore. And the point here is that it's better. It's a better priesthood.
I think the interesting to that point you were just making, out of anybody that you would think, well, we could change this a little bit. He's from the tribe of Judah. This is Jesus we're talking about. And that's the whole point. Silence is not permissible in this situation. But there was still the answer that God had put into place in the plan of how he was going to be the high priest of Jesus. But not even in this case did God change the rules all of a sudden that it's going to include the man from the tribe of Judah in this case, but he was going to be from the Melchizedek order. And I think that's a really important point when we talk about it from an authority standpoint that is being made here in the book of Hebrews that is worthy of this conversation. And so, yes, we go back to Melchizedek, a man that we know very little about, and we don't need to know anything else about him. We just know that Jesus obviously is a priest, and it's greater than the old covenant, and you certainly see him going forward. But I really do appreciate you bringing up that verse. I think that's so important.
And I misspoke a little bit. I said that the only place in the Old Testament that mentions Melchizedek is Genesis. The Psalms will talk about him. You got Psalm 110 in particular that he's going to quote here, but it's all in reference to him. It's not new narrative information about him. This is the one encounter we have with him. David will prophesy about the descendant, the king. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. He'll talk about you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So the author here is going to lean on Psalm 110 to show this is talking about Jesus. He's a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Verse 22 is a key, right? This makes Jesus the guarantor of a better covenant. And so this is a powerful thing to realize, especially as he goes on. This former system had its use, but they were prevented by death from continuing in office. Verse 24, but he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Jesus has defeated death. He's reigning in heaven. He is a priest forever. 25, consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. A powerful verse. And really, as you're coming to the end of chapter 7, about to move into 8, and this is the point, that the priesthood under Levi was one that worked for the old covenant. It was setting up something more. God was going to bring in a new covenant, as we're going to see in chapter 8. He had always planned that. But this was to show what it required to be holy, the cost of being holy, and what sin, the price for sin would have been, and how that had to be taken care of, and that these things could never deal with it completely, as this book is going to go on talking about the sacrifices. But the priesthood, Jesus is better than all of these priests. Jesus is better than the line of Aaron, of Levi. It's because he lives forever. A lot of the times when we've looked at Jesus talked about as the priest here, we've seen it a little bit in chapter 2 and in chapter 4. It'll talk about how he's able to sympathize with us. He can be gentle with us. He knows what it's like to be tempted, because the high priests under the Levitical priesthood, they had their own sins that they had to sacrifice for. But Jesus doesn't have that. Jesus has no sins of his own. He is purely in this office as a high priest to deal with our sins and to make intercession for us. And so you have just this far superior, far better priesthood, and he's going to lean into this fact that this means there's a better covenant that he's acting under.
I love verse 1 of chapter 8. It says, "Now the main point in what has been said is..."
Yeah, in
we have
case all of
such a
this
high
is
priest.
totally like getting lost and
Yeah.
confusing for the person who's listening or reading this, here's what we're getting at.
Yeah. We have such a high priest who has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister in the sanctuary and in the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched, not man. And that's really the point we're trying to make as we go through all of this. Keep reading here. Verse 5, he'll talk about it serves as a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things. This is a point we've tried to make here, and we're going to start seeing it now, where it'll use the word a copy or a shadow of things. The Old Testament served its purpose. I think that's a really important piece that we need to understand. Nobody's talking about the old law from the standpoint, don't go back and read it. It's not worth reading.
Yeah.
Of course it is. But it served its purpose. It did exactly what it's supposed to. So when you come to a verse like verse 6, where he says, "But now he has obtained a more excellent ministry by as much as he is also the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted on better promises." Well, that's obviously 100% correct. But the old law did exactly what it was supposed to do. It did exactly what God wanted it to do, leading up to the new, better covenant. The problem is, as we've talked about in Hebrews, is that people are trying to go back to the old. And that's really where he's going to go going forward now is, why would you go back to this old law? You have a better covenant. You have a better high priest. All these things that were prophesied about in the Old Testament. And you need to understand what's the better covenant we're talking about. So in verse 7, he'll say, "For if the first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion sought for the second." And then he's going to quote from the old law. And then in verse 13, he ends this chapter by saying, "When he said a new covenant, he had made the first obsolete, but whatever is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to disappear." Why would you go back to an old law when it served its purpose, did exactly what it needs to do? We need to read it. We're told in other places it shows us examples. It shows us God's character. There's lessons to be learned from it, but it's not the covenant we're under. And this is better covenant that we are under, the covenant that we need to make sure we're following. And hopefully we all can understand that, but it goes back to what is said in chapter 7. We need to make sure we're doing things God's way. And that's really, again, tying in Proverbs 17, the exact point he's making with that. Are we making decisions based on what's better for us from a spiritual perspective, or focusing on things of this life and the dangers that come with that? And that's the beauty of even using in verses 8 through 12, the old law, and showing it was pointing out the new this whole time that we need to understand.
Yeah, he's quoting Jeremiah here, chapter 31, I believe, is where he's taking this. And the point is, Jeremiah is living under the old covenant, and God's saying under that covenant, I'm going to bring about a new covenant. I'm going to establish a new covenant. We're under the new covenant. If there was another covenant to look for after what's revealed in the scripture, God would let us know. He's going to, as he's set up here, there's not a third covenant to look for. There's not a better thing. We have all things pertaining to life and godliness, as 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 3 will talk about. We've got to realize that we have the better than the old, and it's the best. This is the gospel. This is the thing that's going to carry us through. This is how we have a relationship with God that lets us persevere, lets us grow on to maturity, lets us have the right perspective of our relationship with God and with other people, and that helps us realize the true substance of what it means to be a child of God. And that's something that I think as we're going through Hebrews, now that we're kind of passing this middle point and going to the back half of the book, it's really important to remember. We're going to look at more specific things like the things in the tabernacle, the tabernacle itself. All of these things are kind of pictures that God gave us to point to the real spiritual substance. And that's the same lesson we need to remember today, is that there is this spiritual substance to everything that we do under the new covenant, that it's from our hearts, that we're striving to be the children of God that we're called to be, that we're doing things God's way and trusting his word and holding his word close and walking in his word so that we can truly understand and know and say,
"You are from God."
You are from God. Hey there, thank you so much for watching You Are From God. If you like our content and want to watch another episode, why don't you check out one of these episodes over here or this one right here.